In Hong Kong, pro-democracy protesters took to the streets in the final hours of 2019. The protesters marked more than half a year of widespread demonstrations in the Chinese-ruled city. They formed human chains and organized protests in shopping malls, calling on people to continue the fight for democracy in the new year. Security was also high. Police were on hand, and they did use tear gas to disperse the crowds. This was the first time in a decade that authorities in Hong Kong canceled the popular New Year's fireworks display. They cited security concerns. To talk more about some of the reasons why 2019 has been seen as a year of protest in many parts of the world, we're joined from Georgetown, Kentucky by Christopher Shea. He's a research fellow with the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University. Christopher, we've seen protests happening in democracies, in authoritarian regimes. They're happening over a range of issues, from cost of living to climate. Is there a common thread to all of these protests?
Hi, and thanks for having me on your show. To answer your question, I would say that probably all of these protests are different and important in unique ways. But there might be common threads that connect them all. There is a lot of research to suggest that people have become convinced that government is less receptive to their preferences, especially when their countries are constrained by international institutions, like, for instance, the EU.
And is that why perhaps we're seeing voting rates go down at the same time as more and more of these protests are being sparked?
It is possible. I know from fieldwork that I've conducted in Nepal, there is a loss of sort of faith in political parties as sort of faithful representatives of the popular will. If voters feel that their parties are not going to honor their decisions, then exactly that there's no motivation to actually vote for them. And it might be more effective, they think, to vote on their feet, go and protest.
So by doing that, what have some of these protests accomplished in 2019?
Well, there's evidence that they've accomplished a lot, although so far there are a few regimes that I know of that have actually fallen. But just looking at Hong Kong, which you mentioned earlier, the extradition law has not gone into effect, so Hong Kongers have been able to preserve some of their autonomy that they were hoping to, which is perhaps a major accomplishment.
How does this moment of protest compare to other periods of mass protest in U.S. history? I'm thinking about 1968 or the late 80s, when there was so much unrest in Eastern Europe. Sure.
Well, the early data suggests that we may actually be in a period of unprecedented protests. There might be more protesters and perhaps more protests than at any other time. We do know that in history, the greatest number of protests were basically the anti-communist revolution for the most part. When we're talking about primarily those regimes or those campaigns or those movements that are trying to overthrow entire governments. We'll have to wait and see and wait for more data to know exactly how big the protests currently are, or this global wave.
Are you surprised by any of the places where we're seeing these protests be sparked, and by what has sparked them?
I am not terribly surprised. There is apparently a growing dissatisfaction with government, as indicated by falling voting participation rates. So there might be sort of this global well of grievance that's motivating people to go out on the street. But likely those grievances change a lot from case to case. I think, again, in the Hong Kong case, this is a situation where protest is not so surprising, since they were about to lose a lot of political autonomy. They had pretty high stakes to protest to defend, I think.
And just quickly before we let you go, Christopher, what do you think this shows us about the year and the decade to come?
I think it's plausible that this wave of protests will continue on indefinitely, or at least for the next couple of years. We do know that protest is fairly contagious, to use a technical word, but when protests happen in one place around the world, that's sort of a demonstration effect that makes other places feel that they have an opportunity to do the same. So this might be a snowballing effect that continues and becomes even bigger before it dissipates.
Thank you, Christopher.
You're very welcome.
Christopher Shea is a research fellow with the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University. He joined us from Georgetown, Kentucky.